We have one kind of final chapter of the progressive era, but I don't really want to spend a lot of time on it. I just want to show you the vocabulary real quick and look at the learning targets for a very brief moment, because we've already, in my opinion, done enough on the progressive era. We did the practice DBQ, or many of you did the practice DBQ. I did that in a YouTube video where I went over that. So, if you have any questions on it, let me know. But I want to move on from the progressive era pretty quickly. So this is the final chapter on it, and it's a lot of summary. The new addition, folks, is the Populist Party. We hadn't talked about the Populist Party before. That's going to be the rural response to this industrialization. And you have to know what the populists are after. So I hope you're paying attention now, guys. Populists, again, typically live out west, and they want government ownership of the railroads. Why? Because farmers live and die by the railroad rates, guys. If I've got to ship 10 tons of grain, my profits are going to hinge on how much it costs me to ship that grain to market. Railroad companies are essentially a giant monopoly, and they're giving preferential rates to certain customers, kind of screwing over the little guy. So a lot of the populists are not all of them, not many of them, all of them. The populists demand government nationalization of the railroads and the telegraph system. They also want what's called the free coinage of silver. All of our paper dollars, guys, are backed up with gold at this time. They're not anymore, but they are in the 1890s. Every single paper dollar is backed up by gold. And what that means is there's a limited amount of paper dollars in circulation. These paper dollars are pretty valuable, and essentially the populist guys want more paper currency. You might ask yourself, well, hey, if there's more paper currency, isn't the paper currency going to be worth slightly? Yes. And that is basically how inflation works, but that's not really a concern here. Don't get bogged down in the economic side of it. You just have to know, guys, that they demand that we start printing paper money based on silver. That will allow more cash flow to be in the system, and will allow these farmers to pay their debts a little bit more. They got that famous dude, William Jennings Bryan, who gives that cross of gold speech. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. He's talking about the gold standard. He wants more paper dollars backed by silver. Know the populists. That's the rural response to industrialization. Some of these other learning targets, guys, they're not going to be essay topics. You have to know, though, that in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan is going to make a resurgence. There's going to be huge amounts of lynchings that are occurring. Guys, there's something like 5,000 lynchings that have occurred from the end of the Civil War up through the 1960s. If you break that down, that's like 70 people a month being lynched in the United States. It's a pretty significant number. People are trying to get anti-lynching laws passed, and just be aware that Jim Crow segregation is the law of the land. Plessy v. Ferguson, that Supreme Court decision, has helped white supremacy stay in place, essentially. So just know that that won't be a full-on essay topic in itself, but I could easily see, folks, the struggle of African Americans from Reconstruction on being an essay topic, or the growth of slavery, even though that doesn't have anything to do with growth of slavery there. But those topics about slavery, white supremacy will be big and broad and cover lots of time. We know Teddy Roosevelt's a trust buster, and we know about his new nationalism. Guys, Teddy makes that pretty extreme statement in his new nationalism speech, where he says private property needs to be controlled by the government to whatever extent the public requires it. He's basically saying that we can control your property if we determine it is too big of a trust or too big of a monopoly. It's pretty radical at the time. Teddy Roosevelt is known as a progressive. He's known as a trust buster. We already talked about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington in a different video, so we don't need to do that. We also have talked about the NAACP. That's that political lobbying group that W.E.B. Du Bois founds and operates there. We don't need to do much on the IWW, guys. Those are the anarchists. Those are essentially the lowest of the low on the industrial workers union scale. Those guys are the anarchists. They're causing some violence in many cases, and they essentially give labor unions a pretty bad name. Be aware that they're going to be associated with radical left-wing politics. When we do the Red Scare in another chapter, guys, when we start talking about, remember, the Palmer raids and all those mail bombs going through in the 19-teens and 20s, a lot of the targets for deportation will be members of the IWW. So know that. And we've talked in depth about the level of success progressives have. Here's my thesis statement again for progressive era. The progressive movement was highly successful at bringing about political and social change in the United States. However, civil rights of African Americans actually took a back seat to the progressive agenda, because I want to highlight that shit gets worse for African Americans during this time period. Anyhow, that's my thesis for it. Some more vocab there, guys. If you know some of it, you're good to go. Please remember that on page 662? I'll find it real quick. I think it's 662. Yes. Oh, good guess. 662, guys, on your textbook. There is the list of almost all of the progressive achievements, whether they're Supreme Court decisions, laws, whatever. You don't need to know them all, but hopefully you know like 5 of them. That's all I want to say on the progressive era. Does anyone have any final questions on big business or, tenements in big cities or anything related to the industrial era? Anyone have a question on that? No? All right, folks, we're just going to do one more topic real quick today. This will be a short video. Spanish-American War. We're going to start to talk about how America's role in the world expands. Now, if you've been paying attention and you've done the practice DBQ number 3, or at least looked at it, this is the practice DBQ I put up for you guys this week. I really recommend you do it. And if you take a look, you'll see that this prompt is about what we'll talk about today. It starts down here on page 6, I believe. And it's all about the expanding role of the United States in the world. This is where they want you guys to talk about American exceptionalism. This is where they want you to talk about things like the white man's burden. It's not manifest destiny anymore. It's now American exceptionalism. So it's those types of things. And also the economic outlet. You can't underestimate how important the need for new markets is for the United States expanding throughout the world. So I really, really encourage you guys to get this DBQ done this weekend. We're going to go over it in depth on Monday. Some of you have already tuned in and seen what a good DBQ looks like with this. We read it in an afternoon session, but we'll break it down in depth on Monday. So please, please, please practice this. As always, if you want the feedback, let me know, and you got it. So, all right, guys, back to Spanish-American War and the growing U.S. involvement abroad. First off, guys, let's start talking about the economic motives first. This is the best cartoon you could imagine for understanding the economic motives for America's expanding role in the world. On this essay prompt, this DBQ prompt, you have to include economics in there, folks. We are an industrial nation. We've been industrializing since the 1860s, frankly. Carnegie Steel, Rockefeller and Standard Oil, and a whole bunch of other different types. I'm just getting the low-hanging fruit there, steel and oil. We produce, guys, way more than we can consume at home, whether it's textiles and random manufactured goods or whether it's farm equipment, whatever. We produce way too much stuff to sell at home. If we want to keep this economic growth and the trajectory going up, we've got to start selling stuff abroad, internationally. And China and Asia are essentially going to be the focus and the targets of all this extra economic productivity. We're going to look to open up new markets in Asia. I know that this view might be a little small for some of you guys, but look at what Uncle Sam is carrying. He's carrying education and railroad equipment. He's carrying trains and sewing machines and all these different bridges and steel, different farming implements, all these different products of industrialization. He's carrying them to China. China is willingly accepting them. All those wanted signs are saying, we want all this stuff. Wanted bridges, engines, cars, wanted clocks, trolleys, engines, lights. And what do you notice about Uncle Sam? He is using the Philippines as his stepping stone. Guys, this helps us understand why the Americans are going to hold on to the Philippines. We need the naval bases of the Philippines to protect our new economic interest abroad. That's the best cartoon I can imagine for explaining that. So sink that into your head, please. Beyond economic motives, folks, we also have ideas about American exceptionalism. And that is my vocab term right here. You got to know this vocab term, American exceptionalism. This is the concept that America has a unique role and destiny in the world. And it's our job, essentially, to wherever we can, spread democracy and civilization. We've done this many times throughout our nation's history, folks, especially in more modern history. We attempt to essentially liberate oppressed people and spread democracy and spread our American freedoms to them, because what we got is good stuff. I mean, guys, even though we all know there's problems with this country, I can't think of a better one in terms of freedoms. I've certainly got things to criticize, but man, that's one of the best things about this nation is you can criticize things. American exceptionalism is the belief that what we have is the best, and it's our job to spread it. I certainly believe what we have is the best. I don't know how much we should spread it. It's totally up to you guys to determine how and if American exceptionalism should be spread. But guys, that's one of the major motives for understanding America's expanding role in the world. So you know American exceptionalism, and you know the white man's burden. That's that famous, who's the Jungle Book author? Rudyard Kipling poem where he talks about essentially the dominance of the white Anglo-Saxon race, not only of their civilization, but of their religion, and how it's their duty to spread it to less fortunate individuals. That idea of the white man's burden, guys, helps us understand what we're doing in the Philippines besides using that as an economic stepping stone. We claim that we're civilizing the Filipinos. I think the more reality of it is we're using it for a naval base, but what we're selling the public, guys, is we are saving the Filipinos from savagery. All right, folks. So how do we get involved in the Spanish-American War? Remember, there's a civil war going on right now between Spain and Cuba. Cuba controls Spain, folks. But remember, we believe in American exceptionalism, and so we're going to support the Cuban rebels here, guys. And remembering all these details is not necessarily the most important, but I'm going to try to go through them quickly. We support the Cuban rebels in their struggle against Spain. We view Spain as a colonial oppressor, even though we're about to become colonial oppressors ourselves. We view Spain as the bad guy. We're trying to help the Cuban rebels here. So we've given the Cubans military support, food, and aid, and one of our battleships, the USS Maine, is sitting in Havana Harbor, essentially there to assist the Cuban rebels against the Spanish. One day, mysteriously, the Maine blows up in Havana Harbor. Was it sabotage? Was it attacked by the Spanish? Was it just an accident? We don't honestly know, guys, but this is what gets the United States involved in the Spanish-American War. The phrase is, remember the Maine. See the headline, Spanish treachery. And we're going to use this excuse, saving the Cuban refugees and essentially getting revenge on Spain for attacking the Maine and killing U.S. sailors. This is why we get into the war. You don't need to know anything about the war itself, guys. These different battles that occur, the naval battle at Manila, you don't need to know that. It would be helpful if you remember Teddy Roosevelt, though. Teddy Roosevelt will become a hero during this war. He leads a charge up San Juan Hill, Teddy and the Rough Riders. That's what's important to know. He becomes a very famous war hero after this. That's part of the reason why he's going to be such a national political hero after this, guys. Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. That's literally the only thing I want you to remember about the battles themselves. What you need to remember is the consequences of the war, guys, and what we take. We're going to take Cuba. We're going to take Puerto Rico. We're going to take the Philippines. And we're also going to take a place called Guam. And, oh, man, there's another group of islands out there that I'm forgetting. But for the sake of this, guys, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and also Cuba. You got to know that we are going to essentially turn these areas into American colonies. Cuba, we're not going to hold for very long. And this will be the last thing we talk about here. Cuba, guys, this is the Platt Amendment. You really have to know this one right here. We're in Cuba for a couple of years. We beat the Spanish really quickly, and now the United States military is occupying Cuba. And the Cuban government is expecting to be free. They want the United States to leave. They want to become their own free, independent nation. It's like, thanks, America, for helping us get rid of the Spanish. See you later. The United States, guys, is going to, however, play a very major role in Cuban development from here. And they're going to force the Cubans to develop the Platt Amendment. And this is not in the U.S. Constitution, guys. This is in the Cuban Constitution. What the Platt Amendment says is that as a condition for the U.S. withdrawing all of the troops from Cuba, Cuba will allow the United States to keep a major military base on Cuba. That's called Guantanamo Bay. It will also allow the United States to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever the United States sees fit. And Cuba will not make a treaty with anyone but the United States or without the United States approval. Guys, essentially, we're telling Cuba that anytime we want to, we can intervene in your affairs. If you want to make a treaty with anyone, you've got to go through us, and you've got to let us keep this Guantanamo Bay military base. It's essentially their best harbor. That is what we force the Cubans to do in order for withdrawing the U.S. troops from Cuba. We've essentially turned Cuba into a pro-American haven, guys. This is where Cuba turns into like Las Vegas, folks. This is where the organized crime and the mafia comes into Cuba, because the Cuban government essentially allows American business to do whatever they want. This is the government that Fidel Castro and the communists will try to overthrow. The Cuban government, after we leave, guys, is just a puppet government that does what the United States wants it to do. I probably gave you a little too many details with that Platt Amendment, but you need to know what the Platt Amendment is, guys. We're going to keep the Philippines all the way up until the 1940s when Japan takes them from us. And then after World War II, they will be given their freedom. We still have Puerto Rico and we still have Guam to this day. Understanding, guys, that this is a pretty complex topic and there are a lot of details involved in here. The most important thing to understand is why the United States is getting involved in this stuff. Not understanding all the details once we are involved, it's why. American exceptionalism, the white man's burden, economic output, and industrialization. Those would be the three things I would focus on. The details, oh, Teddy and the Rough Riders and the Maine. Yeah, that's all part of the story. But the open door to China, American exceptionalism, white man's burden, that's more important. You tracking with me? All right. I think we're going to call it a day there, folks, and finish up. No, let's do Hawaii real quick, guys, and then we'll do World War I tomorrow. I'm only going to say like 60 seconds on this, guys. Please be aware that in this same era, it's not taken in war, but we are also going to take the Hawaiian Islands. We've got American companies, specifically the Dole Pineapple Company, set up all over the Hawaiian Islands. And the Dole Pineapple Company essentially requests that the United States overthrow the monarchy in Hawaii. Queen Liliuokalani is a sovereign monarch. She's the granddaughter of King Kamehameha. They've been the monarchy since the 1790s, I believe. And essentially, guys, for like 100 years here. And the United States government is going to put her on house arrest and essentially force her to abdicate the throne and give American companies concessions throughout the islands. This is not a violent overthrow. They certainly don't murder the queen. There's not like a violent conflict between Hawaiians and Americans. But guys, essentially, we flex our muscle. And we tell Hawaii to step aside because we want to utilize these islands not only for military purposes, think Pearl Harbor in the Navy, but also for economic purposes. Think about sugarcane, think about pineapple. We flex our muscle. And, you know, that's what I wanted to say about Hawaii. It'll become a state in the 1950s, or maybe 1960. Anyhow, 50 or 60, one of those. All right, guys, any questions for me? I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share. Does anyone have any questions before we stop recording? Dre, what are you smiling at? I can't hear you because you're muted, but that's okay. Okay.